Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, for years, I think we'd looked at terrorist attacks going on, happening in France, happening in Belgium, and I think we kind of felt, maybe, just maybe, we were a little bit safer than the other countries because we had intelligence services that were on top of the problem. This year, of course, has come as a very rude shock to anybody who had that point of view. And today, a report produced for the government by David Anderson QC talks about perhaps one or two of the failings. The one that's making the headlines is Salman Abedi. This is the man who planted the bomb in Manchester at the arena, which killed 22 people, including young children. And he was someone that was known to the authorities, looked at a couple of times, but it's not just him, you see, because Khalid Masood, the Westminster bridge attacker, was also a former subject of interest, as indeed was Khurram Butt, one of the London bridge attackers. So we have a series of lists out there of people who we think are very dangerous, people who we think are less dangerous. To help us through this and to understand the scale of the problem that our intelligence services are facing, I'm being joined now by Margaret Gilmore, Senior Associate Fellow with the independent security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. She's also the author of The Terrorist Hunters, and her specialist areas include government policy on counter-terrorism, intelligence and policing. Margaret, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So tell me, this big report today given to the government about our intelligence situations and perhaps even being honest enough to talk about one or two potential failings, did it produce for you any surprises?
No, it didn't produce any surprises at all. The profile of the terrorists, when there's an attack, sometimes people like you come on and say, what do you think's going on? And you're pushing in a speculative area. And I often say that I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was somebody who'd been on the radar, who maybe had been dabbled with petty crime or was known as a radical, and at some point had come to the attention of the authorities, and now suddenly they're carrying out attacks. So surprises? No, not at all.
Was there perhaps a blunder with Salman Abedi in that when he left the country to go back to Libya, he was not put on a list, so that when he returned just 4 days before he planted that bomb, we didn't stop him and ask him questions? Yeah,
I have a problem with, saying it's a blunder. I think the most important thing, and I'm really impressed with some of the families who this evening are coming out and saying this, is that the people who carried out this attack are not our security services and our authorities, who are absolutely doing their best and who were gutted when it got through. The people who are to blame for these attacks are the terrorists. Hindsight, however, is a very powerful thing. And hindsight does tell us that in the case of Manchester, with the intelligence that came in, it should have perhaps led to a different reaction, a new investigation into this guy, Abedi, who carried out this particular atrocity. And that's the area they've got to look at. You have to review it when you have these things that do get through, however many don't, and you have to look and say there must be another way.
I certainly wasn't trying to put any blame on the intelligence services, but I'm wondering whether they have sufficient powers. Tell me, Margaret, can you explain to people what the lists are?
Well, what they have is they have a list of about some 20,000, and they're open about this, they told us about it. They have a list of about 20,000 people who they know are extreme and have extreme views, but who they don't have intelligence on that's suggesting that they're about to carry out an attack. Then they have another list of, and some of those are for follow-up later. Just keep an eye on them and let's every now and again go through that list and look at them again. Then they have the list of 3,000. These are people they know are extreme. They have maybe been part of the network of people who have become terrorists. They're people who maybe have a tendency to violence. There's more than one thing that makes them something on the list go ping. Maybe even a teacher, somebody at university, maybe they've been in prison mixing with the wrong type of people. And so the 2 or 3 elements which say, tendency to violence, very extreme, needs watching. And these people have slipped in and out. Some of these people in the attacks this year have slipped in and out of that category. They're followed up on occasion, and then they're not followed up. But I think the key thing is you were asking, your question was, do they need more powers?
Yes.
I'm not sure that they need more powers. I think they have to be more intelligent in the way they are looking at the intelligence that comes in, if you see what I mean. There were signs there that, had they looked at it differently, would have led them to say, actually, this guy has got to be on our radar. He should have gone ping red when he came back into the country from Libya, and he didn't. So I think that if I were sitting in MI5 tonight, I would be saying to myself, look, we've got to find ways of looking and assessing what comes in and getting the right people. Because, Nigel, look at the number of people who actually do carry out terrorist attacks. You know, less than 100, looking at the past few years, a very, very small number. So they have to be looking again at how they can pick those ones out from the 3,000 and from the 20,000. So assessing in a different type of way.
There are some people out there. I mean, Richard Kemp, for example, former UK military commander, has made the argument that we simply haven't got the resources, the money, the people to constantly monitor, particularly the 3,000 people that are on this list. And he's come to the view, and others have as well, that, I'm not saying I subscribe to this, but there is an argument that says, actually, these people should all be locked up right now, no questions asked. How do you respond when people put forward that argument?
Because what happens the day someone comes and says, hey, Nigel Farage or Margaret Gilmore, I've got information that they're a terrorist, and the authorities say, okay, no questions asked, we'll lock them away, we wouldn't feel very happy about it. So I think we live in a democracy, and we have to go through, due course.
Due process.
Yeah, exactly. You can't just lock people away like that. So, of course, I don't agree with that. But I do think they have got to, in this modern world when, we've sent people to the moon and rockets to Mars, there has to be a way of looking and analysing what comes in about people, looking at their behaviour in a more intelligent kind of way. And resources have to go into that. And yes, you can't follow over everybody, nor can you train people up to do that overnight. But I think that we have to look at resourcing again and the type of way we do treat those people, the 3,000 on the list.
And finally,
on the hot list, as it were.
And finally, you're confident that our security services are doing the best job they possibly can?
I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be. I mean, really, I just remember phoning, contacts and saying this got through, and literally people saying to me, you cannot believe how gutted we are and how determined we are and how hard we're going to work. So, of course, they're doing their best. They wouldn't be in the job otherwise. But I think that when things like this happen, they can't just say, just go on as normal. It's not business as usual. They've got to find other ways, and they'll be trying to do that today.
Margaret Gilmore, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and Margaret making the point that they were absolutely gutted that this had happened. I'm going to go to Alan in Aberdeen next, who's got a very interesting story. Alan, good evening.
Hiya, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call.
Not at all. Right, tell us your story, Alan.
I was a sniper volunteer with the Kurdish Peshmerga for 2 years.
Yeah.
Fighting against ISIS.
Yeah.
And the Kurdish Peshmerga security services warned the UK and Europe over 3 years ago about all this that's going on just now. They told them about returning ISIS, returning Daesh to Europe and the UK. Why, Nigel, have we got 450 plus that we know of returning ISIS?
I know.
Sorry, but Nigel, we are treating these people as if they've been on a package all day. Not that they've been away committing mass murder, mass rape, mass child molestation, and we are allowing them to walk our streets. Do you know something, Nigel? Returning ISIS to this country are getting less harassment than I get from the UK security services, and I'm not joking.
Alan, I have heard stories of people like you who've been out fighting against ISIS, who have been called in for extensive questioning and virtually treated as suspects.
Listen, they tried to get me last year, Nigel. Their whole questioning was, as a Peshmerga sniper, I was involved in the Bashikar-Mosul offensive. The whole concern of the UK security was how many ISIS have you killed? How many Daesh have you killed? That's their whole concern.
Alan, how did you answer that question?
I basically said, self-defence, mate. What are you going to do? But the beauty is, government stepped in for me, and the Ministry of Peshmerga stepped in and basically said to the UK government, look, Alan has been helping train and he's been fighting alongside our Peshmerga. You don't... They look after their own across there. He's fighting against terrorism. He's not a terrorist.
Yeah.
But the UK, they treat me worse. I'm getting treated worse than a terrorist just now.
Well, Alan, as I say, that story I've heard from several other people, and I can assure you that over the course of the last few months, you know, and given that it's something I campaigned on politically to say we shouldn't allow a single person from this country who's been to fight for ISIS to come back, to my knowledge, one person has been stopped from coming back, and 450 are out there in our streets. And it is, Alan, a total failure of government in this country, and particularly a lot of this burden lies with a woman called Theresa May, who was Home Secretary for much of this time, and she's very good at talking tough at party conferences and then doing absolutely nothing about it.
Totally agree with you, Nigel. But the other one is, Nigel, we're allowing these people to freely walk our streets, and I'll tell you what, if people think that the UK isn't rehousing, giving them jobs to placate them, these people are been treated like they've been on a package holiday of mass murder. Why are the people of Syria, Iraq, etc., are they not entitled to justice? The thing is, Nigel, honestly, the UK couldn't get me on that. I'd love to send you an email or something to show you what's going on.
No, but, well, Alan, please do. And when we come off air, you can pick up my details, and we'll look at this and go into it. No, I want to
by the government.
No, I want to find out more. But Alan, answer the question that I'm now asking LBC listeners to answer over the course of the next 3/4 of an hour. What should happen to somebody if they become a person of interest to the security services? In particular, the 3,000 suspected terrorists in this country, what should the authorities do, in your opinion? I've lost him. He's gone. He was telling such an amazing story. Well, anyway, folks, please, you answer that after the break. What should happen to people who are on the security list? What should the government do to try and make us safer? You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. A government report tells us that Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, was known to the authorities and investigated twice. It also tells us that one of the London Bridge attackers was known to the authorities, and indeed the Westminster Bridge attacker had been looked at several times. And I'm asking you, what do you think should happen to these people once they become people of interest to our security services? And to be clear, there are 3,000 people on that suspected terrorist list in terms of their contacts, and 20,000 people that have been looked at and investigated because of their links. And if you think at least the 3,000 should be locked up immediately, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Or if you think we have to maintain everything this country's ever stood for, and people must be innocent until they're proven guilty, text to 84850. Or maybe you think the security services need a huge financial and personnel boost, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can comment on Facebook, where you can see me as well. And very interesting call we had before the break of a guy that had gone out fighting against ISIS, who felt he'd been treated pretty roughly by the UK authorities since he returned. It's a story I've heard before. And I have to say, one of the ways we answer this question is border controls are at the heart of all of this. How, why have we allowed 450 brutalised ISIS fighters back into our country? And why was Salman Abedi not picked up 4 days before he committed that atrocity in Manchester as he came back into this country from Libya? Plenty of lovely, airy-fairy ideas about free movement of people in Europe and all over the world, but it doesn't work, it doesn't wash in an age of international terrorism. Border controls matter, and if the price of making us a bit safer is it takes all of us a little bit longer to get through Dover, then my view would be, so be it. Omar is calling me from East Ham. Good evening, Omar.
Hello there, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call. To answer your question, if we've got around 20,000 people who did go abroad and fight for ISIS and they are returning to the UK...
It's not that many, Omar.
I believe that
It's not that many. Let me just do the numbers again. It's 450 returned ISIS fighters. It's 3,000 people on a suspect terrorist list because of their direct connection with ISIS type people, and it's 20,000 people connected or linked in some way to bad people. So they are the numbers.
I think the most sensible thing to do would be to release their identity to the public. If the public know, if the public know who they are and what they are capable of, then at least the public will be vigilant as well. The public will be vigilant.
The trouble, Omar, is supposing there is a chap who's on the 20,000 who has been involved in small-time crime, perhaps has been in prison a couple of times, and may not be a particularly good egg, but is not actually a terrorist. And we announce, Omar, the name of the street on a big Sheffield council estate where he lives and the number of the house. What do you think is going to happen to him?
I think, this is what I think. If the person is, and let's say he's been involved with petty crime in the past, and let's suppose that he is really trying his best to turn over a leaf, get a job, stay on the straight line, he's naturally going to stay out of trouble. Okay, and I think that the neighbors around him, they will notice it as well. But if he is constantly, trying to get involved with organizations that's going to bring trouble to our streets, okay, the neighbors will also pick that up too. So I think what we have to do is just, trust the judgment of the public.
So you wouldn't fear, Omar, sort of vigilante-style actions, the risk of a house being firebombed or something like that?
I think what we need to do is that we need to we need to inform the public that, listen, these guys have been involved in not have been involved, but let's say we inform the person who is on the watch list and that, listen, we're going to release your identity to the public, okay? And the thing is that we just take the judgment of the and we just rely on the public to make a good judgment.
All right, Omar, no, you've made your point. Release their identities and let what some would call natural justice take its course. That's the view of Omar from East Ham. And look, folks, I'm beginning to sound a bit like a softie on this show tonight. I'm not. It was me in 2014 who said publicly I felt we had a fifth column living within our country. People who were born here, raised here, have our passports and yet wish to destroy our way of life, wish to kill us. I mean, you'd have thought I was the most evil person that had lived on European soil for 75 years for daring even to say this. I am not soft on this subject, but I have to say I do disagree fundamentally with Omar. If we were, not every one of those 20,000 is a terrorist, all right? Some of them, sadly, are. But if you release people's identities, goodness only knows what the consequences of that would be. That really worries me. Sean is calling me from Wolverhampton. Good evening, Sean.
Hi, Nigel.
So, Sean, new caller to the show. What would you do?
I think the government at the moment is playing long ball on the situation. What I mean by that is the services are actually sort of following these people, trying to gain intelligence on these people. But the problem is they're losing them, and then they go out and cause these problems like the Manchester attacks, the London attacks.
Yeah.
They're playing the long ball in the situation. I believe what they should do is bring these people in, interrogate them. If they feel that, these people are a threat, interrogate them, obviously get the information they need to get, obviously then put the power in place to watch them, follow them then. But I just feel we're going about things wrong at this moment in time. I really are, because what we're doing is putting British people's lives at risk. I mean, I go to Luton quite a lot, and I can tell you now, Luton is a no-go area sometimes.
Is it as bad? Is it really as bad as that, Sean?
It is. It is a non-go area sometimes. You go down at night time, and you feel as a white British male, I feel out of place. I wouldn't say fear for my life, but I feel like I'm not welcome. And that's not what we should have, and I think this is...
And do you see that, Sean? Do you see... And I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about ghettoisation that's occurred in some of our towns and cities, and it certainly has. Do you feel that's a breeding ground for extremism?
I think I do quite a lot of work in the Asian, the Islamic community through my work, and I just get a general feel sometimes that the younger youth have got nothing to do other than to listen to people like this because it gives them hope. And I think we're not doing nothing about it. We're shutting down community centres. There's a lot of different things that Theresa May is putting forward that's causing issues in this country for the youth going forward.
Sean, where I agree with you is I think irresponsible immigration policies, a lack of integration, has in fact bred an environment in which there are many parts of the Muslim country, population in this country living in areas with the lowest levels of employment, etc., and they are environments in which bad ideologies can take off. But, I mean, the trouble is, that's something we've got wrong over the last couple of decades. Not easy to deal with now, completely overnight. What do you think, Sean, of the argument that some put that we should lock up the 3,000 people on that suspected terrorist list?
I think that we should build a jail that can hold these people, and if they meet certain criteria, that maybe someone's put together to say, yes, this person meets this criteria, they should be put in that jail together, isolation, not mixing with the public. What I mean by the general public in congregating together in the jail, I mean they should be segregated, and then obviously that's what I just think they should do, because at the end of the day, they're out on the street. I could go out tomorrow to Birmingham, my local bull ring, and it could happen, and that's people's lives being affected.
All right, Sean, thank you. Sean making some very strong points. He feels parts of Luton effectively are no-go areas. I'm not sure that's true, but wouldn't it be worth visiting and actually finding out, I think, and doing a bit of real journalism on it. Sean, he's gone now, but he's wrong. The idea that you take these 3,000 people, you put them in a purpose-built prison, do you know what would happen? You'd make them worse, not better. We did this with over 300 people who were connected to the uprising, the Irish nationalist uprising in Dublin in 1916. We chucked them into a camp in Wales where they were all together, and whilst they were there, they had a brilliant idea, and they formed the Irish Republican Army. Segregating people of similar views and putting them in prison makes them worse. I get on Twitter, where would we get the extra 3,000 prison places from? Well, that's a good point, because the prisons are full, but I'm sure if we had the will, we could find it. Nigel, I think everyone on the security list should be tagged. Simple, says Angela. Well, in some ways, it's a bit surprising, given the world we're living in, that they're not tagged, isn't it? At least I think so. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:30, and in the light of a government report that says maybe, just maybe, had circumstances been read differently, the Manchester bomber Salman Abedi could have been stopped before he committed that appalling atrocity back in May. I'm asking you, what should happen to people who go on to government suspect lists? But before that, we debated last night whether Arlene Foster and the DUP had done the right thing by stopping May's Brexit negotiations in Brussels yesterday. And this was Arlene Foster speaking today to Sky News.
Obviously, we'd been in discussion with the Conservative Party right throughout, and we'd asked for the text on a number of occasions, to be told that there was no text at that particular occasion. We spoke on Sunday evening, didn't have text, and the text landed with us on late Monday morning. Now that left us in a very difficult position. We had to look at the text, we had to try and understand what the ramifications of the text was, and when we had a chance to do that, we realised that in no way could we sign up to that text, because essentially it was making a red line down the Irish Sea.
So that was Arlene Foster today, and the story is that this text that agreed there'd be no differential in rules between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, effectively that Northern Ireland would stay part of the customs union and the single market, the deal with the Irish government was that it would not be shown to the DUP until effectively it had been signed and delivered in Brussels. They thought they could bounce the DUP into this, just as Mrs May has managed to bounce the Eurosceptics of Johnson and Gove into all sorts of concessions on money, the rights of EU citizens in this country, and I guess she just thought, look, they're not going to kick up, they're not going to cause a stink, they wouldn't dare risk bringing down the government because that might mean that nasty Mr Corbyn got in and he doesn't like Northern Ireland very much, he'd give it away tomorrow. No, I think what Mrs May banked on is that the DUP would be like her, career politicians with no principles whatsoever. Well, they've met their match with Arlene Foster, and I think she's played an heroic role over the course of the last 24 hours. And if that means that at next week's summit, on the 14th and 15th of December in Brussels, if it means we do not move on to talk about trade, if it begins to signal that no deal is possible, and frankly, given the unreasonable demands that have been made by Brussels from day one, it's very difficult, or it's impossible, really, to have any deal that doesn't betray the Brexit vote. If that's where we're heading, so be it. Bring it on, is all I can say. And well done, Arlene Foster. Terrific, in my view. But I'm a Brexiteer, I would say that. So what do we do? There are 3,000 people on a suspected terror list. There are 450 people who fought for ISIS freely wandering our streets, and 20,000 people on a list where they've been linked to bad people and they've been investigated at some point in time, and they include Salman Abedi of the Manchester bombing, they include Khurram Butt of the London Bridge attacks, and they include Masood, who carried out the Westminster Bridge atrocity. And Julie is on the line from Glasgow. Good evening, Julie.
Hi, Nigel. There's a few wee points I want to say first.
Yep.
First of all, have we got to wait before our people die with these animals? Okay? And they should be sent back to their own country. They should be sent back.
Julie,
our borders should be shut.
Julie, let's just deal with these points one at a time, shall we? Okay. Number one, how can we send them back if they've got British passports?
The ones that are on the top radar list, on the top of the list, they've got to be sent back. Or what we should do is, when is the government going to stop all this nicey keeping our borders open? They've got to be shut in these countries like Mr Trump's doing. Shut the borders down, and none of them get in.
Julie, I mean, nobody in British politics has argued more strongly for absolutely tough border controls from countries of terror, and you could argue that Donald Trump has taken that a bit further, but I do believe in extreme vetting. Absolutely I do. But Julie, the bigger problem we've got here is that so many of these people have got British passports. In those circumstances, where do we send them?
Just like really, that's quite an impossible question to ask.
I know.
It's an impossible question to ask. The only other thing is, where is my human rights? What if I had my son and my daughter gone out and one of these animals has murdered my family? Maybe something should happen in the government to some of their families and they might get a better opinion.
Well, Julie, we don't wish that on anybody.
No, I don't wish it. I'm not saying I wish it would happen. I'm just saying if it should happen. Do you understand? We are too nice in this country. This is what's wrong with it. We're patting everybody in the head and giving them a lollipop. And it's out of order. Something has to be done. People's getting fed up with it.
Would you lock up, Julie? Would you put in prison and lock up the 3,000 people on that suspect terrorist list?
Well, can I say something? I won't say it over the phone. I won't tell you what I would want to do. And I think that'll say it.
All right, fair enough. Julie, thank you. Julie taking a very hard line there. But Julie also identifying a problem. That, yes, whilst open borders and whilst border control is in many ways at the heart of this, Salman Abedi should not have been able to come back into this country from Libya without being stopped 4 days before that bombing took place. Of that, I feel very strongly indeed. But a lot of these people are homegrown. A lot of them have become radicalised in this country. They become radicalised in schools. They become radicalised in bad mosques. They become radicalised in our prisons. now one of the primary places for the radicalisation of people. Indeed, the Westminster Bridge attacker was radicalised in a prison in Norfolk, and I've always thought that if radicalisation is taking place in schools and prisons which the state runs, surely we could make a better job of it. But it doesn't get away from the fact, and I'll say this to Julie, who's just gone, and all the rest of you, you can't deport people to where they come from if they come from here, and it is part of this problem. Loads of messages. Gordon says, more border controls will stop all of this. Jill says, I think that the recruitment procedures for the security services needs examination. Not sure I agree with that, Jill. I still think, from what I know of it, that we're doing a very good job dealing with what is a huge problem. And one thing that the Cabinet were told today by the head of MI5 is that 9 major attacks were stopped this year. Thank goodness, and I do have no reason not to believe that to be true. Pauline says they should be deported or imprisoned, but I'm afraid the human rights lawyers would have a field day, costing the taxpayers millions. Well, Pauline, of course, it's very difficult to deport people under European human rights legislation, something that Brexit could make a little bit clearer, although under this Prime Minister, not, I would have thought, much chance of that. And Jamie says, if the police suspect people of planning terrorism, then they should be able to access phones and social media and whatever it takes to stop the criminals committing a crime. Jamie, they do that already. Already, there is a huge amount of monitoring on social media and telephones and all of the rest of it. In fact, if you remember, one of the arguments after the Westminster Bridge attack was that the attacker was contacting people on WhatsApp, and should that be available to the security services, or shouldn't it? And that debate took place much earlier this year. Alex is a new caller from Leeds. Alex, it's a thorny question, this, isn't it? What do we do about the people on these lists?
Well, to be fair, I think the whole problem comes down to communities. Like, if you don't know your own neighbour, how do you know who? Do you know what I mean? You don't know anything about them. So when people like Tommy Robinson have made their name from having Luton just completely overtaken or taken over by a certain demographic, which is fine. I've got nothing against immigration. I think it's a good thing. But when you have it in such high numbers, you can't plan for places, you can't plan for NHS, you can't plan for school places, police officers, and it goes on and on and on. So the problem is trying to control the amount of people coming in so people don't feel like they need to either live with their own or they resent the people coming in, because that's where we are at the moment. If people, even if they're coming from a different country, most people in the UK I know would want to speak to them and find out who they are, but they don't get the opportunity because there's so many people now living in like almost ghettos of their own type, if you like.
Divided communities, Alex, and I absolutely agree with that. We have got very divided communities, and I accept that has been a contributory factor to much of what is effectively, in this case, homegrown, some's imported, but a lot of it's homegrown terrorism. But Alex, what do we actually do about the people on these lists right now today?
I'm not advocating locking them up, because then that goes towards a police state. I don't want to go into town and go through a checkpoint, you know what I mean? And that's not a life I want to live, to be honest with you.
No.
However, with the people that are on the list now, like the sexual offenders list, which is, I think that is that public. You can go and look up who's been, I don't know, done something naughty in a sexual way. They should do that type of thing, not put their address up, not do everybody, but if there's someone in your local area, their mugshot's there and their name, nothing else, not any like details, so people can go on, because then the anonymity of what that person is doing is then being blown up. So not like a bit like exposure. If you know who it is, no one's going to want to talk to them. One, if they are doing the terrorism stuff, that's a link, and then they're going to be brought into it. And then, you know, that kind of like peer pressure, but I'm not advocating going out their house and stabbing them all.
No, quite.
None of that horrible stuff. But if their face was there, a bit like in the dock, where you can see people that the police are currently after and people that are being prosecuted.
OK, Alex, you're the second person that's advocated that. Publicise who they are, not necessarily where they live. Publicise who they are so that people can keep an eye on them. I'm not convinced it's an argument that works, but hey, at least 2 of you tonight have advocated that. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. What on earth should the government do with the people that are on these suspect terror lists, or the even bigger list of 20,000 people who are linked or associated, or have been linked or associated in some way with bad networks and bad people? And I think, the view that we need tougher border controls, stricter immigration, be really careful about who we let into this country. I think a lot of people listening and engaging tonight agree with that. I think the idea that it's completely nuts that we've let back 450 people who've been fighting for ISIS back into Britain. Also, I've met with a fair degree of agreement tonight. What nobody can solve for me is what to do with British-born and raised jihadis who own a UK passport. And we can talk about some of the reasons that have caused this, but what to do about it is a hell of a problem. And I know there are people out there that think simply lock them all up. And it's tempting to think that's right. But not only does it go against every fundamental principle of justice in this country, it also risks alienating a huge section of moderate Muslims within Britain. And that's why I've always been against it. But I'm all for 24/7 surveillance. I'm all for us being very, very strict indeed in terms of our monitoring of these people. And I haven't got a problem with tagging people who are on a suspect terrorist list. I just think locking people up without absolutely knowing they've done something wrong, I think it brings big risks with it. But hey, maybe you think I've just become a bit of a softie. I don't know. Nathan is a new caller from Hull. Nathan, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Lovely to speak to you.
Lovely to speak to you. So what do you think, Nathan?
Well, my argument is I think everybody is tagged. Everyone has got a mobile phone, and everyone is tracked. No matter where you go, everyone is tracked.
Yes.
And number two, it's not about the people who we do know about, who the intelligence services do know about. It's people that don't know about. Now, I'm a long-distance lorry driver, and I go into Europe quite a few times, and you can get from Calais across on the shuttle without going through any border checks. Sorry, you can do that.
So you drive your lorry,
yep,
onto the shuttle, yeah,
yep.
And there are 4 shuttles an hour, aren't they, going virtually 24 hours a day?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're saying to me that you get to the terminal just outside Calais, you tap a code in that's your booking number or whatever it is, and you're straight onto that shuttle, yeah?
Yeah, you go through the border where they check your passport, but only once have they been called into the scanner. And it is up to yourself whether or not you go and go through the dog section. I take it you'll know that area if you've been through there.
Well, I go through, Nathan. I go through in a private car on a regular basis. I've never been through in a lorry, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, I've drove up the A1, the M1, and parked in laybys. Most recently was when I parked up outside Muscombe Services, and there was a foreign registered truck, and he had an immigrant in the back, a legal immigrant. And the police, we were speaking to the police officer, and he said, we can't do anything because he's under the age of 18. That's what he's told us. Now, to me, he didn't look under the age of 18.
Oh,
but
yeah.
As soon as he says he's under the age of 18,
Yeah, they're under 18, then they're put into care, they're given refugee status, and they've got away with it, haven't they?
Yeah, and they get a British passport, and then how long before they're committing an attack like they did at Manchester?
Yeah, so Nathan, your argument actually is some of these people with passports aren't necessarily homegrown, but we've just been too weak in dealing with them. Nathan, the whole business of child refugees from Calais, many of whom, when I've seen their photograph, look like prop forwards who could be in their mid-30s, has made me angry for a long time. And of course there was one of those who was under 18, of course, who tried to blow up the London Underground not so long ago. Nathan, what can we do? What can we do? And I mean, last time I looked at it, something like 12,000 lorries a day coming through Calais and into Folkestone and Dover. What can we practically do to protect ourselves from bad people getting in your view?
Well, personally, I believe that your average UK registered truck and your average UK driver, it's in his best interest not to allow these immigrants in the back of his truck. Now, I personally check everything. I get inside the trailer, and that's just before I'm boarding.
Yep.
and if I'm not happy with something, I'm not happy. I mean, we've got lorries trailers, which are parked up with slashes in the roof, where they've jumped on the roof and tried to slop down. You know, this is the thing, but I don't really think there should be a lot of checks, obviously, on the UK trucks. I think 1 in 10 should be checked, because the UK trucks aren't necessarily going to bring them over.
And 1 in 10, Nathan, from the stories you're telling me, would represent a big increase on where we are now.
Yeah, especially I reckon with the foreign registered trucks, maybe you should check more, because you don't know their backgrounds, you don't know.
No, Nathan, listen, that's all very, very interesting indeed. And let me ask you very quickly. You know, we've got some people coming into Britain through routes that you're talking about. We've got homegrown jihadis. What would you do, Nathan, with the 3,000 people on that suspect terror list?
It's a difficult subject, really, because you can't lock them up, because, like we all know, in prisons now, they get together, they form little groups, and that's where they become radicalised. Even the moderate Muslims become radicalised.
Yeah, it's not easy.
I think they do need to be tagged. They do need a lot more checks, and they do need to be able to be stopped any time of the day. And maybe like a probation officer, they have to report to a probation officer twice a week, and they have to be inspected.
Yeah. No, Nathan, sensible stuff. Thank you. I do think tagging, reporting, surveillance, I do think all of those things, frankly, are unavoidable, because the risks are simply just too great. Kevin is calling me from Doncaster. Kevin, good evening.
Hi, Nigel.
Do we need to get tougher, Kevin?
We need to get a lot tougher, Nigel.
Yep.
Well, you know, millions of people live under the rule of law in Britain. And I would say that if you're not going to live under the rule of law, then there's a different law for you. Your human rights have gone.
OK. So do you think these people, by virtue of the fact they're on this list, have already transgressed beyond the reasonable norms of our society?
Yeah. If I speed down the road, you know, I'm lucky if I don't get a ticket. Or if I go into the congestion area in London, I know I'm going to get a ticket. Just don't do it, and then, you know, you don't have the consequences. But this country, Nigel, the leader is so weak.
Well, we know that.
We need to get tough, really tough.
Yeah, well, I'm very pleased to say that our leader ran into Arlene Foster yesterday, and that's a very good thing. But in terms of, look, Kevin, I'm all for getting tough. You know, I completely understand that point. But specifically, what do we, apart from surveillance, tagging, what do we actually do to make ourselves safer?
Well, there's two people who caused this, Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair. I mean, we went into Iraq and stirred a hornet's nest, and this is what we're getting in return.
You see a direct causal link, do you?
Yeah. Why would we need to go into the Middle East? Why did we go into the Middle East? You know, because it's even a worse mess now than when we went in.
It's a little bit difficult, Kevin, listening to that, to disagree with you. I do agree with you. Thank you. Kevin's right. Whatever we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you remember, Mr. Blair told us it would make the streets of London safer. It has done the opposite. However, had we not gone in to Afghanistan or Iraq, there would still have been a problem. We may just have made it a whole lot worse. Mark on Facebook says, tag all the list with strict curfew and teach British values. Well, maybe, Mark, we should have been teaching British values a very, very long time ago. These people that are on these lists need to be treated as terrorists, not treated as disobedient children. They're murderers, says Chris. Use technology to tag and track all suspects 24/7, says Chris. Well, I think there is general agreement. We're going to have to monitor these people even more strictly than we have been to date. But I have to say, this question of how to deal with homegrown jihadis is one that almost no one has been able to answer this evening. It is a very real problem. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow at 7. Coming up at 10 tonight is Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.